By the spring of 1883, there were 11 straw-walled houses standing on the open prairie west of Hays City, Kansas. Every one of them was still warm inside. Every one of them had survived the worst winter in a decade. Not a single one had been Nora Prescott's idea to build, but every one of them had been built because of her. Stay with me. In the autumn of 1880, a fever swept through the Prescott farm outside of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It took Nora's husband first, Thomas, a quiet carpenter who could joint a timber frame in his sleep. Then it took their daughter, only 14 months old. The girl never had a name on a gravestone. Nora buried her beneath the elm where Thomas had hung a swing the week she was born. Nora was 23. She sold the farm for $62 and a roan mare named Birch. She packed a trunk with clothes, a set of Thomas's tools, and a book her grandmother had kept, a German-language journal filled with drawings of walls, roofs, foundations, and notes about keeping heat inside a house, using nothing but earth and straw. Her grandmother, Katrin Engel, had grown up in the Black Forest, in a farmhouse insulated with rye straw packed between timber walls. She had told Nora once, years before, "Wood holds a house up, straw keeps it alive." Nora hadn't understood then. She would. She rode west because there was nothing left behind her. She had no family in Lancaster anymore. No farm, no child to raise, just a mare, a trunk, and the low hum of grief that doesn't go away, but eventually stops screaming. The journey took 11 weeks. She followed the rail lines when she could, sleeping in boarding houses when she had the coin and under the open sky when she didn't. Birch was steady and patient, the kind of horse that didn't spook at thunder or balk at mud. Nora talked to her sometimes, not for comfort, but because silence across that much empty land could hollow a person out. She passed through towns that were barely towns, collections of buildings held together by proximity and hope. Men asked her where her husband was. Women asked her where she was headed. She answered the second question and not the first. Somewhere west of Topeka, the trees thinned and then disappeared entirely. The land opened up like a held breath releasing. Sky and grass in every direction, so flat that the horizon looked painted on. Nora had never seen so much of nothing. It frightened her for exactly one evening. Then she woke the next morning, watched the sun come up across 50 unbroken miles, and understood that emptiness and possibility were the same thing, seen from different angles. She crossed into western Kansas in the spring of 1882. Western Kansas in 1882 was not a place that welcomed anyone, let alone a woman alone. The land lay flat and wide, broken only by shallow creek beds and the occasional rise of hard-packed earth. There were no trees for miles, no timber to cut, no coal to mine. The wind came in from the northwest and never seemed to stop. It scraped the topsoil loose and threw sand against anything that stood upright. Most of the settlers who had come out before Nora were men, cattlemen mostly, or would-be wheat farmers who had believed the railroad pamphlets promising fertile soil and easy fortune. A few had wives, fewer still had houses that deserved the name. The frames were thin, nailed together from shipped lumber that cost more than a season's wages. Gaps yawned between boards. Doors didn't sit flush. The wind found every seam. Nora filed her claim on a quarter section 6 miles south of Oakley, 160 acres of dry grass and sand. The land office clerk looked at her as though she had asked for a plot on the moon. "Ma'am," he said, "that stretch has been abandoned twice." "Then it should be cheap," Nora said. It was free, Homestead Act land. All she had to do was improve it and live there for 5 years. She set her trunk down on the open ground and looked around. The nearest neighbor was Garrett Coulter, a cattleman with a thin frame house and a thick opinion about everything. He rode over the first evening, his hat pulled low against the dust. "You planning to build?" he asked. "I am." "With what?" Nora didn't answer. She was already walking toward the dry creek bed, studying something in the grass. The dog came 3 days later. She was gray-brown, shaggy, with a narrow face and amber eyes that caught the firelight like pennies. She appeared at the edge of Nora's camp at dawn, sitting perfectly still, watching. Nora set out a tin of water and a strip of dried beef. The dog ate carefully, never taking her eyes off Nora. By the second day, she slept at Nora's feet. By the third, she followed Nora everywhere, to the creek, to the claim stakes, to the spot where Nora had begun dragging hay bales out of the tall grass. Nora called her Dust. Dust never barked. She watched. Along the creek bed, scattered for a quarter mile, lay hundreds of abandoned prairie hay bales. They had been cut and bound the previous season by a rancher who had gone bust and left them where they fell. Sun had bleached the tops white. Rain had dampened the edges, but the cores were dry and dense, tightly packed grass compressed into blocks nearly 3 feet long and 18 inches high. Most men who saw them thought cattle feed. Some thought waste. Nora saw walls. She had studied her grandmother's journal by firelight every night since crossing into Kansas. The drawings showed walls built from rye straw bales, stacked flat, staggered at the seams like brickwork. Wooden stakes driven through each layer held them together. Plaster made from local clay sealed the exterior against weather. The walls were thick, sometimes 2 feet or more, and the dead air trapped inside the straw held heat the way a stone cellar holds cool. Her grandmother had written in careful German script, "Straw does not burn easily. When plastered, it does not rot when sealed. It breathes just enough to stay dry. A straw wall is not a weak wall. It is a patient one." Nora began hauling bales in June. She used birch and a travois she built from willow poles and rope. Each trip brought 4 bales. The creek bed was 1.5 miles from her claim site. She made 3 trips a day, sometimes 4 if the light held. Dust trotted alongside, her amber eyes scanning the grass for snakes. The work was punishing. Each bale weighed between 40 and 60 pounds, and lifting them onto the travois meant bending, hauling, and stacking under a sun that turned the air into something you could taste. Dry and metallic, like licking a hot stone. Nora's hands blistered in the first week. By the second, the blisters had hardened into calluses. By the third, her palms were the color of old leather and just as tough. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her shoulders ached at night in ways that made sleep difficult, but she kept a rhythm. Wake before dawn, eat cornbread and dried beef, hitch birch, haul bales until midday, rest through the worst heat, then mix plaster or cut stakes until dark. Routine was the only thing that kept grief at arm's length. Purpose was stronger medicine than rest. By mid-July, Nora had stacked over 200 bales on her claim. She laid them out in the shape of a small house, 16 feet by 20, with a door facing south and 2 window openings on the east wall. She staggered the seams, overlapping each layer like a mason would lay brick. Then she cut willow stakes, sharpened them to a point with Thomas's draw knife, and drove them down through each layer with a mallet. 3 stakes per bale, each one pinning the layers together so the walls locked into a single mass. The walls rose thick, nearly 2 feet across. When she pressed her hand against the interior surface, the straw gave slightly but held firm. It was not rigid like timber. It was dense like packed earth. It felt like something that could last. The neighbors noticed in August. Garrett Coulter rode over first, reining his horse in at the edge of her claim and staring at the half-built walls with his jaw set. "What in God's name is that?" he asked. "A house," Nora said. She was mixing creek clay with chopped grass in a shallow pit she had dug near the south wall. "That's hay. It's straw, and it'll be plastered by October." Garrett pushed his hat back and looked at the walls the way a man looks at a dog walking on its hind legs, impressed by the effort, unconvinced by the outcome. "Ma'am, I don't mean disrespect, but straw won't hold out here. Too much wind, too much sand. You need lumber if you mean to survive January." Nora nodded. "I appreciate the concern," she said. She went back to mixing plaster. Garrett rode off shaking his head. He told the others. Within a week, 3 more men came by to look. Jonas Petty, who ran cattle on the section north of Nora's. Frank Whelan, who had a soddy that leaked in every rain. And Pete Strand, who fancied himself the closest thing the settlement had to a mayor. They stood in a loose half-circle and watched Nora trowel wet plaster onto the straw walls. "Sod won't hold here. Too much sand in the soil," Jonas said. "But at least sod is honest dirt, that there is a feed shed." Frank laughed. "My cows would eat her house before Christmas." Pete Strand crossed his arms. "Ma'am, I've been out here 4 years. I've seen wind take a roof clean off a frame house. What do you think it'll do to stacked hay?" Nora pressed another handful of plaster into the seam between 2 bales. The mixture, creek clay, chopped grass, and a little ash from her fire, went on smooth and set firm in the dry air. She had tested it on a small section first. After 3 days of sun, it was hard as low-grade cement. "I think the wind will go around it," she said quietly. "Same as it goes around a hill." Pete shook his head. "Hills don't have straw in them." Nora said nothing. She finished the section and moved to the next. Dust sat at the corner of the house, watching the men with her amber eyes until they left. September came dry and hot. Nora worked from first light until she couldn't see her hands. She finished the plaster on the exterior walls, 2 coats, the second thinner, rubbed smooth with the flat of her palm. She framed the doorway and windows with salvaged timber from a collapsed homestead 3 miles east, pieces she had dragged back on the travois one by one. She built a roof frame from the same salvage, shallow pitched so snow would slide, and layered it with more straw bales, then tarred canvas on top, then a final coat of plaster along the edges to seal the seams. Inside, she set a small iron stove that had come with her from Pennsylvania. She ran the pipe through the east wall, not the roof, a detail from her grandmother's journal. "A pipe through the roof invites leaks," Katrin had written. "A pipe through the wall loses less heat and sheds rain away from the opening." Nora built a narrow bed frame from willow and rope, a shelf for her lamp and her grandmother's journal, a pegboard for her coat and Thomas's tools. The floor was packed earth, hard and smooth, swept clean every evening. By October 1st, the house was done. From the outside, it looked like a squat, pale lump on the prairie, thick-walled, low-roofed, plastered the color of dry clay. It had no grace, no fine lines, no porch or trim or painted shutters. The men rode by and shook their heads. "Feed shed," Frank Whelan said again. "A child's fairy tale," Jonas Petty added, waiting to collapse. Garrett Coulter said nothing this time. He just looked at the walls for a long moment, then rode on. November brought the first hard frost. Nora woke to ice on the water bucket outside, but none on the bucket inside. She noticed this. She wrote it down in the margin of her grandmother's journal in English. Interior temperature steady. Stove banked low. Walls hold heat through the night. December was cold, but manageable. The wind picked up. Sand and snow mixed together and drove against the south-facing walls of every structure on the prairie. Frame houses groaned. Gaps between boards let in fingers of cold air that no amount of rags could plug. The Coulter place lost a shudder to a gust. The Whelan Soddy took on water through a crack in the north wall. Nora's house sat quiet. Dust slept by the stove. The plaster showed a few surface cracks where it had dried unevenly, but the walls beneath were solid. The straw didn't shift. The willow stakes held. Then January came. The old-timers would later call it the Epiphany Storm because it arrived on the 9th of January, close enough to the feast day to earn the name. But there was nothing holy about it. The temperature dropped nearly 40 degrees in half a day on January 9th, 1883. Nora had seen the sky change that morning, the color shifting from pale winter blue to iron gray in the space of an hour. She had felt the barometric pressure change in her ears, a subtle popping that her grandmother had once called the sky clearing its throat before it shouts. She brought birch into the small lean-to she had built against the north wall, packed with extra straw. She filled every bucket. She banked the stove with the densest fuel she had, dried cow chips and a few pieces of salvaged hardwood, and closed the damper to a slow, steady draw. Dust paced twice around the interior of the house, then settled beside the stove with her nose on her paws. Animals knew. They always knew before people did. By noon, the wind hit. It came from the northwest, like a moving wall. Not gusting, constant. A pressure that leaned against everything upright. Snow came with it, not falling but flying sideways, striking surfaces like thrown gravel. The temperature, already below zero, kept dropping. By nightfall, it had passed 30 below. Across the prairie, houses began to fail. Jonas Petty's frame house had a north wall that bowed inward under the weight of drifting snow. He and his wife stuffed blankets against the gaps, but the cold came through like water through a sieve. Their stove, a big cast-iron box that ate fuel like a furnace, couldn't keep up with the drafts. By evening, the water bucket inside had a crust of ice on it. Frank Whelan's soddy held its shape, but not its warmth. The crack in the north wall had widened. Wind moaned through it. His children slept in a pile of blankets near the stove, shivering. Garrett Coulter's place fared worst. His north wall gave way just after dark. Not a collapse, but a slow buckling, the frame twisting as drifting snow pressed against it. Cold air poured in through the gap. He nailed a board across it, but the damage was done. The room wouldn't hold heat. By nightfall, doors began to open across the prairie. Garrett Coulter came first. He appeared at Nora's door just past 7 in the evening, his boots crusted with ice, his coat white with driven snow. Dust raised her head from the floor and watched him with her amber eyes but didn't growl. "Ma'am," Garrett said. He was shivering. "I wouldn't ask if I had a choice." Nora opened the door wider. "Come in." He stepped inside and stopped. The air was warm, not hot, not stifling, but steady. The stove burned low, its iron sides barely glowing. There was no draft, no whistle of wind through gaps. The thick straw walls absorbed the sound of the storm outside, reducing it to a low, distant hum, like hearing a river from inside a cave. The temperature inside, Nora had checked it with a small mercury thermometer she kept on the shelf, was 54 degrees. Comfortable, livable, sustainable. The lamplight was steady too, no flickering from drafts. Just a warm, even glow that touched the plastered walls and made them look almost golden. Garrett stood in the middle of the room and said nothing for a long time. He turned slowly, looking at the walls, the ceiling, the way the plaster met the window frame. He was seeing it now. Not a feed shed, not a fool's construction, but a house built by someone who understood something he had missed entirely. "How is it this warm?" he finally asked. "The walls," Nora said. 2 feet of straw. Dead air doesn't move. It holds whatever temperature you give it. Garrett pressed his hand against the wall. His face changed. Jonas Petty arrived an hour later with his wife. Frank Whelan came after midnight, carrying his youngest boy wrapped in a quilt. Pete Strand came at dawn, having waited until pride lost its argument with frostbite. They sat in Nora's house, 7 adults, 2 children, and a gray dog with amber eyes, and they felt warmth. The storm lasted 3 days. On the second day, Jonas Petty walked to the east wall and pressed his hand flat against the interior surface. The straw gave slightly beneath the plaster. He held his hand there for 10 seconds. "It's warm," he said. "The wall itself is warm." Nora nodded. "Dead air," she said. "Straw traps it. 2 feet of trapped air doesn't conduct cold. It's the same reason a hay barn stays warmer than an open field in winter." Jonas pulled his hand back and stared at it, as though it had told him something he didn't want to hear. "I called this a feed shed," he said. "I remember," Nora said. "I was wrong." When the storm broke on the 12th, Nora's house still stood. The plaster was scarred. Wind-driven sand had pitted the south wall and cracked the surface in 2 places near the window frame. But the walls beneath were solid. No drifting snow inside, no frozen water buckets, no collapse. The men went back to their damaged homes and began repairs. But something had changed. Within a week, Garrett Coulter came back. He didn't ride this time. He walked, carrying his hat in his hands. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "How do you stack the bales so they hold?" Nora showed him. She walked him to the south wall and pointed out the staggered seams, the way each bale overlapped the one below it by half its length, like brickwork. She showed him the willow stakes, 3 per bale, driven through with a mallet. She showed him the plaster, 2 coats, the first thick with chopped grass for grip, the second thin and smooth for weather. Garrett listened. He asked questions. He wrote nothing down, but Nora could see him memorizing. He had a builder's eye, even if he hadn't known it. "What do I owe you?" he asked when she was done. "Nothing." He looked uncomfortable. "That doesn't sit right." "Then pass it on." Jonas came the following week. Then Frank. Then Pete Strand, who had the decency to apologize before he asked his first question. "I told folks you were foolish," Pete said. "That wasn't fair." "No," Nora agreed. "It wasn't. I'd like to learn how to build what you built. Then I'll show you." She showed them all. She charged nothing. By March, Garrett Coulter had torn down his damaged frame house and begun stacking bales on the same foundation. He used Nora's method exactly. Staggered seams, willow stakes, 2 coats of plaster. His wife helped him mix the clay. Their children drove the stakes. Jonas Petty built a straw addition onto his frame house, wrapping the north and west walls in bales and plaster. The difference was immediate. His wife told Nora the stove used half the fuel it had before. Frank Whelan abandoned his soddy entirely and built new. His house was the largest on the prairie, 20 by 24 feet, with a divided interior and a root cellar dug beneath the floor. By the time the grass turned green, 4 new straw bale houses stood within 10 miles of Nora's claim. By summer, there were 6. Word traveled the way it does on open land, slowly, carried by riders and freight wagons and the occasional letter. A man from Colby rode down in May to see the houses for himself. He stood inside Garrett's new place and pressed his hand against the wall the same way Jonas had done in January. "I'll be damned," he said. A woman from Waikini came in June. She was a widow, like Nora. She had a quarter section and no money for lumber. Nora spent 3 days with her, teaching her how to identify good bales, dense at the core, tightly bound, dry enough to stack, but not so dry they crumbled. She taught her how to sharpen the stakes, how to mix the plaster so it wouldn't crack in the summer heat, how to angle the roof for snow. The woman's name was Ruth Alder. She built her house in 9 weeks with the help of 2 neighbors who had learned from Garrett, who had learned from Nora. The chain was unbroken. That autumn, Nora did something she hadn't planned. She sat down at her table one evening, with dust asleep by the stove and the wind tapping gently at the plaster, and she began to write. Not in her grandmother's journal. That was Katrin's, and Nora would not write over her words. She used a plain composition book she had bought for 12 cents in Oakley. She wrote instructions, step by step in plain English, with small drawings copied and adapted from her grandmother's sketches. How to select bales, how to test density, how to lay the first course level on uneven ground, how to stagger seams, how to sharpen and drive stakes, how to mix plaster for different seasons, wetter in summer when it dried too fast and cracked, drier in autumn when the air did the work, how to frame windows and doors, how to run a stovepipe through the wall, how to patch cracks before winter. She made 3 copies by hand and gave them to Garrett, Ruth, and the man from Colby. Each of them made copies of their own. Knowledge, Nora had come to understand, was not like money. It did not get smaller when you shared it. It got bigger. The years passed the way. Prairie years do, measured not in dates, but in seasons, planting and harvest, frost and thaw, wind and stillness. Birch, the roan mare, grew old and stiff. Her foal, a dun-colored colt Nora named Cedar, took her place, pulling the travois. Birch spent her last years standing in the lee of the house, out of the wind, eating hay from the same stock that had built the walls. Dust aged too. Her muzzle went white. Her amber eyes grew cloudy. She still followed Nora everywhere, but slower now, and she slept more. In the autumn of 1887, she didn't wake up one morning. Nora buried her on the south side of the house, where the sun hit first. That winter, a young dog appeared at the edge of camp, gray-brown, shaggy, amber eyes. She looked so much like dust that Nora's breath caught. She called her Ember. By 1890, there were straw bale houses in 4 counties across western Kansas. Some were small, single-room shelters for new homesteaders with nothing but land and labor. Others were substantial, 2-story structures with plastered walls 2 feet thick, warm in winter, cool in summer, standing solid against the wind. Nora never took credit. She never asked for payment. She never turned anyone away who came to learn. She did keep teaching. On summer evenings, when the wind lay down and the grass turned gold in the low light, people would come to her place. They sat on benches Nora had built from salvaged timber and listened while she explained the principles. Dead air for insulation, staggered seams for strength, plaster for weather, stakes for unity. Work with what the land gives you. Don't fight the prairie. Build from it. She spoke quietly. She answered every question. She demonstrated with her hands, those calloused, sun-darkened hands that had stacked every bale, driven every stake, smoothed every inch of plaster on the first straw house on the Kansas plains. Garrett Coulter, who had been the first to mock her and the first to ask for help, became the loudest advocate. He rode as far as Dodge City telling people about the method. He brought doubters to Nora's house and let the walls speak for themselves. I called her crazy, he told anyone who would listen. She was the only sane one among us. In the spring of 1895, Nora sat on the bench outside her door at dusk. Ember lay beside her, head on her paws, watching the grass move. Cedar stood at the lean-to, his dun coat catching the last light. Nora was 38 years old. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. Her hands were mapped with scars and calluses that she could read like a diary. This one from the draw knife slipping in the first summer. That one from a willow stake that splintered while she drove it. The long, pale line across her left palm from the day she cut herself mixing plaster on a piece of broken glass hidden in the creek clay. Each mark was a paragraph in a story written in skin. The plaster on the south wall had been repaired 4 times. The willow stakes had been reinforced twice, but the walls stood. 13 years, and they stood. The straw inside had darkened and compressed, but it had not rotted. It had not burned. It had not collapsed. The house had outlasted 3 blizzards, 2 droughts, a hailstorm that shattered every glass window in Oakley, and the persistent, grinding wind that never fully stopped. A girl, Ruth Alder's daughter, now 12, had walked over that afternoon to ask Nora about mixing plaster for a chicken coop her mother wanted to build. The girl's name was Katrine. Ruth had named her after hearing Nora talk about her grandmother, and Nora had never said so. But the name caught in her throat every time she heard it. It was the right kind of pain, the kind that reminded her something good had been carried forward. Nora had shown her how to mix the plaster. She had guided the girl's hands through the clay and chopped grass, showing her how to feel when the consistency was right, not too wet, not too dry, holding its shape when pressed but giving slightly when spread. She always showed them. Sitting now in the quiet, Nora opened her grandmother's journal. The pages were soft from handling, the ink faded in places, the German script familiar as her own handwriting. She turned to the last page Katrin had written, a passage Nora had read 100 times. A wall is not a wall because it keeps things out. A wall is a wall because it keeps things safe. Build for the people who come after you. Build with what you have. Do not wait for what you lack. Nora closed the journal and set it on her knee. Across the prairie, in the direction she couldn't quite see but knew by heart, new walls were rising. Straw and clay and willow stakes. The same method, the same material, the same knowledge passed from hand to hand to hand, growing larger with each passing. The wind picked up, the way it always did at dusk on the plains. It moved across the grass in long rolling waves. It found Nora's house and it went around.